Now, South Africa's Minister of Foreign Affairs gave a speech a couple of days ago, a speech which can be looked at as very militant. Not militant because it is causing people to become violent or it is calling for people to be violent, but because it is filled with a sense of urgency when we talk about what she's trying to address. And this is the speech that we want to talk about today and look at what she was saying and how it applies to us. What are the real issues that she was trying to address in urgency? Of course, the speech was given in support of Palestine, as you are seeing what she's, the scarf she's putting on. But she mentioned in this speech a couple of issues that are going on within the African context, on the African continent itself. And she spoke about geopolitics and what is going on the international stage. And of course, she spoke extensively about the issue of Palestine and how, to a certain extent, she's been frustrated, or the government in South Africa has been frustrated in acting independently and going about to do what it is supposed to do in the interest of the African people. Of course, we do recognize that we have a lot of differences currently on the African continent when it comes to the foreign policy of the various African countries. We see on the other side, in the western part of the African continent, Ghana has supported Israel, and President Akufo-Addo was in the United States recently, and he was speaking. When he was speaking, he spoke in support of Israel. We saw Kenya also on the other side spoke in support of Israel. But South Africa, as a country which has been under occupation before and colonialism and apartheid, identifies with Palestine because of what it is seeing as a behavior that was practiced on the South Africans during the apartheid era. So South Africa has held this position strongly. And of course, this also speaks to the position which countries like Algeria, which were under some form of brutal form of apartheid and colonialism by France, and Algeria also has come out to be in support of the people of Palestine. Now, she mentioned, if I may start with issues about Africa and the African Union, that when she was at the African Union beginning this year, we remember that this year Israel was ejected from the African Union as an observer. She realized that Moussa Faki, who is the chairperson of the African Union Commission, had taken it upon himself to give an observer status to Israel. And yet Israel doesn't qualify as an observer according to South Africa, according to what South Africa is seeing, and other countries, of course, on the African continent. Israel does not qualify to have an observer status at the African Union. And of course, we have Palestine already is an observer at the African Union. Now, what she realized is that Moussa Faki, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, had taken it upon himself to give an observer status to Israel, which was illegal. It's not supposed to be like that. This is supposed to go through the African heads of state. Now, she mentions that on finding out, as she tried to find out how was this possible, she moved around the house. And of course, we are talking about in Addis Ababa, the headquarters of the African Union. She moved around to find out how is it possible that Israel was able to get an observer status at the African Union without the heads of state voting on this issue. Now, she mentioned that she was shocked to find out that majority of the African countries actually did not support South Africa in ejecting Israel. And actually, some of these countries were supporting Israel to have an observer status at the African Union. And of course, this is simply because of the work which Israel has been doing. And that work has been the use of money and corrupting various African countries and African leaders like when we talk about Musa Faki, he has no right to admit a country to an observer status without consulting the African heads of state. But he did this. So it is likely that Musa Faki, who's the current chairperson of the African Union Commission, was bribed into accepting Israel into the African Union and giving Israel an observer status. Now, she mentioned that Morocco and Israel are using a lot of money to influence the African countries so that it is allowed into the African Union to be an observer. Okay, it is using bribes and certain tactics which are unethical for it to gain influence on the African continent, so that these countries can be able to accept its aggression towards Palestine, so that the countries, the various countries of the African continent will accept Israel's aggression and killing and occupation of Palestine, which South Africa definitely is refusing. And of course, we saw that after the work which she did, Madame Naledi Pandor, after the work she did at the African Union and talking to other heads of state, and of course, ganging up or collaborating with Algeria, we saw that Israel was able to be ejected when the African Union was sitting, the heads of state were sitting in the African Union recently. But also she mentioned that it is not done yet. It was just suspended. The observer status of Israel was just suspended at the African Union. But Israel is still working in the background to make sure that it is admitted into the African Union as an observer. And of course, what we can predict from this is that Israel, if it enters into the African Union as an observer, it will be working towards making sure that Palestine is ejected from the African Union as an observer. Of course, that would be the next step. And legitimize, making sure that it legitimizes its occupation of Palestine, because it will see that all the African countries have accepted this aggression. And of course, this is unfortunate for us as African people and as countries who have gone through colonialism and slavery under the hands of Europeans. And it is the Europeans and the United States who are supporting Israel in this activity of occupying Palestine, the people of Palestine and their land. What South Africa is saying actually is the position which the Pan-African world has held since, even when the Organization of African Unity had been found. The position on the African continent was that there should be a two-state solution. The Palestinians should have their state, and Israel should also have its state. Everyone has a right to have a state. And if Israel has been able to convince the world that it left the Middle East and came back, and it has been able to assert itself, of course, with the support of the United States and Europe, then people accepted. Everyone accepted that Israel has a right to stay. So if Israel has a right to stay, then that means the Palestinians too have a right to have their own state. So Israel has an obligation also to accept that Palestinians have a right to a state in themselves as a people. Now, these are the issues which Madame Naledi Pandor is trying to address and is trying to put out the position of South Africa. And of course, we understand that South Africa is one of the countries on the African continent with the strongest foreign policy. And that foreign policy majorly addresses the issues of the African continent, the interests of the African continent, the concerns of the African people. Even when you hear her speaking in this particular speech, she mentioned it at the end of it, that we have to advance the interests of the African people. But to a certain extent, certain leaders on the African continent, some leaders on the African continent, they seem to be negligent. Let me say negligent. And some of them, they seem to have abandoned the interests of the continent, and they concentrate in their various small enclaves, in their various small countries. And this actually has ended up leaving our African continent very vulnerable. And this is an issue of great concern, of course, and it should be an issue of great concern to us as African people. So She spoke extensively about that fact that the African continent is divided on this issue, that many countries are supporting Israel. And of course, this is a very unfortunate situation. Now, my purpose, of course, is to analyze this speech and be able to break it down for you, what she was saying. So she mentioned that the African civil society, of course, itself, and she spoke about trade unions. It is unfortunate that in some countries in Africa, there is even no trade unions, or if there's trade unions, those trade unions are not very vibrant. They are not very vibrant, that they talk to each other, even to the extent of contacting their fellow trade unions in other African countries to find out what is happening there, and then strategize and collaborate when it comes to advancing the interests of the African people. So she said that the trade unions and these progressive movements have to speak up. And she means activists. The activists on the African continent have to speak up. And this is where we are needed, very much, including you who is watching, anyone who is out there watching, that you have to speak up. You have to contribute something. She mentioned, for example, the Biden speech. Biden gave a speech in support of Israel, and he claimed that the Palestinians are terrorists. And of course, we have seen this strategy being used by the West when it is supporting or it is advancing its own interests. It says that those ones who are fighting against imperialism are terrorists. And let us remind you also that President Mandela himself, was called a terrorist. So this is a strategy which is normally used by the West to advance its own interests. So she says that there should have been a condemnation by the activists, the progressive forces on the African continent, or even all across the world, in South Africa itself, even on the African continent, to condemn President Biden's speech, which he gave, that he continued to allow Israel to go in and bomb the innocent Palestinians, those ones who are even not involved in the war, the children and the women and the elderly, people who are innocent, and destroy hospitals, destroy schools. And this is not acceptable even in a war. When a war is going on, when there's an all-out war, like what we are seeing between Russia and Ukraine, for example, it is unacceptable to bomb hospitals. It is unacceptable to bomb, schools. And yet this is what we are seeing that Israel is doing. So she spoke about the need to use boycotts, for example, use all types of methods to be able to boycott, for example, the goods that are coming from Israel. The trade unions, let people work on boycotting. All tools should be used. Of course, she went ahead to speak about all the different methods, that were used during the fight against apartheid, the struggle against apartheid. Okay, so she spoke about the fact that we should be able to work with international partners, international stage, whereby we talk about international solidarity. We should be able to work together in order to combat any forces that are skewed up against those forces which are against the interests of the global South. She spoke about, of course, BRICS. She spoke about other techniques of organizing the underground, not only actually working with the international solidarity movement, or having solidarity with other countries, like, for example, Cuba, which are fighting against this aggression by the West, this imperialist aggression and neo-colonial aggression, but also organize the underground forces. This includes even armed struggle should be organized, mass mobilization should be revisited. All these techniques should be revisited, because there is a tendency by the West currently to push against the global South, because the global South has been demanding for a multipolar world. And because they are seeing the advance of this multipolar world, then they have decided to fight against it. They have decided to use all techniques of bribe, of corrupting movements, to be able to fight against this advance and this demand for a multipolar world, of course. But what jumped out for me again is the fact that as African civil society, we have to step up our game, because there's a lot of challenges on the international stage. And those challenges on the international stage, they cannot be combated by only the governments. So if we have identified the governments which are willing to work with us as African civil society, then we should reach out and also organize and collaborate with them. And this is something we have been speaking about on this channel consistently, that we need to have African civil society working with the progressive governments, so that if they have the resources, because some of these governments, they have access to resources. So if they have these resources, then they can be able to help us, for us to advance those struggles together with them, where we have those interests and where our interests are merging. So she spoke about the importance of us working together with these governments and not abandoning the struggle to the governments themselves, for example, the ministries of foreign affairs, to fight these struggles, because they have the duty of representing the interests of the whole country. At the same time, synthesizing or trying to harmonize their policies with that of the African continent. You have seen that, for example, South Africa is on the path, especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of South Africa and the government, ANC, has been on the path of in representing the interests of the African people. But what you see is that other African countries are on another path, supporting imperialism. And this is, of course, very unfortunate. And of course, they are using money. They're using the IMF, which she definitely spoke about, the fact that the IMF has been monopolized by the West, and it has been turned into a tool of exploiting the global South instead of being a tool for helping these countries to develop. And she spoke about the UN resolution which was passed, whereby the global South should have a right to development. These countries have a right to development. We have a right to technology transfer. We have to call for the cancellation of debt. And so she spoke about institutions like, for example, BRICS, which have been instituted, institutions like the New Development Bank of BRICS, which have been instituted to take care of the interests of the global South, to be able to transact in their own currencies without being enslaved by the United States dollar, which has become a tool for enslavement, of course, working together with the Bretton Woods institutions, which they have refused to reform. And she also spoke about the issue of the fact that the UN has been monopolized by the West, especially by the four powers, and yet by the five powers, founding members of the United Nations, who have the veto powers and sit on the United Nations Security Council permanently. And these countries, actually, they are the ones who are causing majority of the problems on the global stage. Now, these problems, what she said is that we cannot combat them without the help of the African civil society and all the progressive forces on the ground. And this is very, very important. I think that we pay close attention to what she's saying. So she's saying that, what I'm reading from what she's saying is that it is impossible for only the government without the general population to carry out these struggles, whether it is the support for Palestine, whether it is the reform of the international institutions, when it comes to the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, whether it is the behavior of the international system or the international actors like the United States and these global powers to check their behavior. It cannot be done by only the countries like South Africa, which is struggling alone, maybe to some extent, because the global South, to a certain extent, is caught between these countries who are always pushing that the global South should do as they want. The global South should do as the United States wants, but the United States should not do as the United Nations says. That is why we are hearing about international law. And the United States has its version of international law, which it calls the rules-based order, which is not written anywhere, but it says everyone should follow the rules-based order. The rules-based order. We have the United Nations Charter, which everyone is supposed to subscribe to, and which everyone subscribes to, but the United States doesn't follow the United Nations Charter, and even the resolutions of the United Nations, like, for example, a unanimous resolution was passed in which all countries of the world agreed that the United States should lift its sanctions and blockade of Cuba, but the United States refused. And this was a United Nations resolution. So the United States feels that it should act with impunity on the global stage, yet at the same time feels that it should command other countries to obey the United Nations resolutions, yet it doesn't obey the same resolutions. And so we see that at the United Nations, it was agreed that Palestine should have a state, and borders were drawn in 1948. But Israel refused to obey the United Nations, refused to respect the United Nations. So the powerful countries now, they do not obey or they do not respect the resolutions of the United Nations. Yet these powerful countries are always forcing the poor countries to respect the resolutions of the United Nations. Now, this is what she's saying. What she's saying is that we cannot force these countries to obey the resolutions or respect the resolutions of the United Nations without working with our civil society, with African civil society. So what I'm sensing is that she's appealing to the African civil society to come together and work with the governments, especially on the African continent, which are willing, and of course also on the international stage. And of course she called for the mobilization of the media, which is very important, so that all these can work together to combat these global challenges. And of course she lamented about the 60s compared to the 60s, that today these organizations, African civil society, is not organized as they used to organize in the 60s and even in the 90s, when they were combating and fighting against apartheid. But she insisted that we have to organize, we have to mobilize the media, we have to wake up the people who are slumbering, people who have become complacent, or some people who have even to some extent given up and said that this system cannot be changed. So those people, as African civil society, and especially Pan-Africanists, majorly for me, the ones I call the people who hold the keys to the new Africa that we want, they have to work harder than ever before in order to wake up these people who are slumbering, work with the media, work with international partners in order to move in this direction. So it was really a very optimistic speech, but at the same time, it was enlightening, and it was also, of course, heartbreaking to a certain extent, because she sees that there is a lot of pushback from the West, but there is very little that African civil society is doing. So with that being said, I would like to thank you. My name is Kwame Gonza. Go ahead and support the channel. The channel is very small. It's still very small. It's still growing. And I want to thank you, everyone who is watching the channel and you have been able to support this channel. This channel, we do analysis of African affairs and international geopolitical issues, in which we give it a Pan-African perspective, and we talk about the African point of view when it comes to global issues. And these are the things which Madam Naledi Pandor was speaking about, that Africans need to come out and speak about issues. They need to make a contribution when it comes to issues which are happening on the global stage, because if we don't speak up, then no one will know that we are present as Africans, and this is very important. So thank you very much, and this is my contribution. Support the channel, and we will take it from there when we get to another video. Thank you very much. My name is Kwame Gonza, and the channel is called Africa Reimagined. God bless you.